Coming home always sounded simpler in memory than it felt in real life. For 6 months, Petty Officer Caleb Mercer had measured time in engine vibrations, maintenance logs, and the endless rhythm of waves striking steel. At sea, every day resembled the one before it. The same narrow bunk, the same fluorescent lights, the same smell of machine oil mixed with salt, the same voice over the ship's intercom announcing another watch rotation. People often imagined sailors standing dramatically against sunsets, staring into the horizon while thinking profound thoughts. Caleb knew the truth was far less cinematic. Most days were spent crawling through equipment compartments, replacing circuit boards, troubleshooting failed communication systems, and drinking coffee that tasted like burnt metal. It was honest work, necessary work, but lonely work. As the taxi turned onto Maple Street, his shoulders finally loosened. Home. Not the grand kind advertised in military commercials. Just the quiet neighborhood outside Norfolk where modest houses lined tree-shaded streets, American flags fluttered from porches, and everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. His small white house appeared exactly as he remembered. The porch light, the flower boxes, the blue shutters that probably needed repainting. Something else caught his attention. The lawn had been freshly cut. The mailbox stood repaired. Someone had swept the front steps. He smiled despite himself. "Lena," he murmured. Only one person would have noticed every little detail. The taxi stopped. As Caleb stepped out carrying a duffel bag over one shoulder, the afternoon air smelled like fresh-cut grass and detergent drying beneath the July sun. Across the narrow yard separating the two houses, Lena Brooks stood beside a clothesline, pinning white sheets that danced gently in the breeze. She hadn't seen him yet. Her auburn hair was tied into a loose knot. An oversized college sweatshirt hung over denim shorts despite the summer warmth. One bare foot rested against the grass while she reached for another clothespin. Caleb hesitated. He had imagined this moment more times than he cared to admit. Maybe she'd wave. Maybe she'd smile. Maybe they'd hug awkwardly. Then go back to pretending they were simply good neighbors. He opened the gate. The metal latch clicked. Lena looked up. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The basket slipped from her hands. White towels spilled across the lawn. She didn't even glance at them. "Caleb?" Her voice cracked. He barely had time to answer. She was already running, barefoot, straight across the grass, ignoring the stones, ignoring the sprinkler, ignoring everything except him. She collided with him hard enough to nearly knock his duffel bag from his shoulder. "Oh my God." The words dissolved into a laugh that sounded suspiciously close to tears. "You're home." Caleb instinctively wrapped his arms around her. She felt smaller than he remembered. Warmer. Real. For several long seconds neither of them spoke. Neither realized every curtain on the street had quietly shifted. Mrs. Donnelly from 3 houses down smiled knowingly from behind her kitchen window. The Johnson twins stopped riding bicycles. Even Mr. Alvarez paused halfway through washing his pickup truck. Small-town neighborhoods miss nothing. Eventually Lena stepped back. Only then did she seem to realize she was still holding on to him. Color rushed into her cheeks. She laughed nervously. "I guess I forgot how to act." Caleb looked down. "You lost your laundry." She followed his gaze. Sheets and shirts lay scattered across the grass. "Oh." Another embarrassed laugh. "I did." Neither of them moved to pick them up. Instead, they simply stood there smiling like strangers who somehow already knew each other better than anyone else. "You cut my lawn. You noticed. You fixed the mailbox. The hinge was broken. You watered the roses." They looked lonely. Each answer came so naturally that it felt as though they had continued a conversation interrupted only yesterday rather than half a year ago. "You didn't have to do all that," Caleb said softly. "I know. Then why?" Lena looked away toward his porch. "The house feels." She searched for the right words. "Sad when you're gone." Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. Just honest. Caleb felt something tighten inside his chest. That sentence should have sounded ordinary. Instead, it carried 6 months of waiting. 6 months of checking mail. 6 months of watering flowers that weren't hers. 6 months of leaving the porch light on every evening because she knew he liked seeing it when he came home. He wanted to tell her everything. That every letter she'd mailed became the highlight of his week. That he'd reread them until the paper softened. That sometimes, somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, He'd imagined walking across this very yard simply to ask her to dinner. Instead, he smiled. Thank you. Only 2 words. Far too small. Lena nodded. Welcome home, Caleb. This time she didn't hug him. She simply looked at him with an expression that made the distance of 6 months seem both impossibly long and strangely insignificant. Neither of them noticed the forgotten laundry still scattered across the grass, because at that moment, something far more important had already fallen into place. Not love. That had been there for a long time. Only the first crack in the careful walls both had spent years building around it. The first morning home always arrived before the body believed it. Caleb Mercer woke at 5:17 a.m., long before the alarm on his nightstand had a chance to ring. For a few disoriented seconds, he stared at the ceiling, waiting for the low mechanical hum of a Navy destroyer and the muffled footsteps of sailors changing watch. Instead, he heard birds, a lawn mower somewhere down the block, the distant bark of a golden retriever. Normal life. It should have been comforting. Instead, it felt almost too quiet. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and rubbed a hand across his face. His duffel bag still sat unopened against the bedroom wall. Half his uniforms remained neatly folded inside, carrying the unmistakable scent of steel, detergent, and seawater. 6 months living shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of people. Now an empty house. The silence echoed. The kitchen surprised him. Someone had stocked the refrigerator. Milk, eggs, orange juice, fresh fruit. Even his favorite dark roast coffee sat unopened beside the machine. Caleb frowned. There wasn't a note. There didn't need to be. Only one person knew exactly what he bought after every deployment. He smiled despite himself. Lena. Again. Always Lena. He brewed a cup of coffee and wandered through the house, noticing details he'd overlooked the afternoon before. The bookshelf had been dusted. The dying fern in the living room had somehow become healthy again. His porch cushions had been replaced. The leaky kitchen faucet no longer dripped. Even the loose screen door that had annoyed him for nearly 2 years closed perfectly. None of those things had happened by accident. Each repair whispered the same sentence. Someone was thinking about you while you were gone. That realization warmed him more than the coffee. It also frightened him. Across the yard, Lena stood on a step stool trimming hanging flower baskets. Unlike yesterday's impulsive embrace, today she looked composed, guarded. She wore faded jeans, an old Norfolk State University t-shirt, and gardening gloves streaked with dirt. When she noticed him standing on his porch with a coffee mug, she smiled. Morning. Morning. You sleep okay? Better than I expected. I figured you'd wake up before sunrise anyway. He laughed. Still predictable. You've always been predictable. She climbed down from the stool. Coffee? I already have some. I meant with me. His heart stumbled. Oh. She laughed softly. I make better coffee than you. That's probably true. Her kitchen felt brighter than his. Sunlight poured through wide windows overlooking the backyard. A radio played quietly from somewhere near the sink. There were photographs everywhere. Family vacations. College friends. Her parents. A golden retriever she'd lost years ago. One frame stopped him. It showed his own front porch during autumn. Pumpkins lined the steps. A wreath hung on the door. The porch light glowed warmly beneath the evening sky. You took a picture of my house? Lena looked embarrassed. It wasn't supposed to be your house. What was it? The light. He looked at her. She busied herself pouring coffee. I liked how it looked. You always turned it on? Every night. You didn't have to. I know. She stirred cream into her mug. It made the street feel less empty. Caleb knew she was leaving something unsaid. So was he. They spent the morning talking about ordinary things. Neighbors. Local restaurants. The grocery store that had been remodeled. A new coffee shop downtown. Topics that felt wonderfully unimportant after months discussing deployment schedules and equipment failures. Yet every conversation seemed to circle back towards something neither dared touch. When are you leaving again? Neither asked. Because neither wanted the answer. That afternoon Caleb decided to clean the garage. He found another surprise. The workbench had been organized. Tools sorted by size. Oil stains scrubbed from the floor. A stack of unopened mail waited inside a labeled plastic container, each envelope arranged by date. Even the batteries in his emergency flashlight had been replaced. He sat on the old wooden stool and stared around the garage. It didn't feel maintained. It felt loved. That word unsettled him. Not because he didn't want it. Because he wanted it too much. He remembered something his commanding officer had once said during deployment. You don't ask someone to marry the uniform. The younger sailors had laughed. The commander hadn't. You ask them to marry every goodbye. At the time, Caleb hadn't understood. Now he did. Military relationships weren't measured by anniversaries. They were measured by departures, missed birthdays, cancelled vacations, phone calls that never came because the ship had lost communication, weeks of silence, months of wondering. He looked toward Lena's house through the open garage door. She deserved certainty. Not this. Late that evening he sat on the porch watching the sunset. The neighborhood slowly settled into its familiar rhythm. Children rode bicycles home before dark. Parents called them inside for dinner. Sprinklers hissed across green lawns. Across the yard, Lena carried a watering can between flower beds. She glanced over. You eating tonight? I was thinking takeout. She made a face. That's not real food. I survived Navy cooking. Exactly. He laughed. So what's your proposal? I made too much lasagna. You planned that. I absolutely planned that. When? Yesterday. Before you knew I'd say yes? I knew. You sound confident. I've known you 7 years. She smiled. You never say no to homemade lasagna. Dinner felt dangerously easy. Too comfortable. She teased him about finally replacing his outdated television. He teased her for still owning DVDs in the streaming era. They argued over baseball, shared memories of neighborhood block parties, laughed until neither remembered why. It felt less like two neighbors, more like two people who had accidentally skipped years of dating and landed somewhere deeper. That realization scared Caleb, because it made him imagine a future, and every future he imagined eventually ended with another deployment, another goodbye, another porch light waiting in the dark. After washing dishes together, Lena stepped outside onto the back deck. The summer air had cooled. Fireflies blinked lazily above the grass. Caleb joined her. Beautiful night. She nodded. It always is after a storm. There wasn't a storm. She looked toward the horizon. There was. Not outside. Inside her voice. He noticed it immediately. Something had changed. Her smile faded almost as quickly as it appeared. You okay? I'm fine. Lena. She leaned against the railing. Do you remember? About 3 months ago. He searched his memory. I was somewhere near Guam. You couldn't receive messages. No. She nodded slowly. I know. Silence. Long enough to become heavy. What happened? She shook her head. Nothing. Lena. I said it's nothing. But it wasn't. He could hear it. See it. Whatever had happened during those missing weeks still lived behind her eyes. It appeared for only a second before she buried it again beneath another practiced smile. I'm just happy you're home. She changed the subject so smoothly that another person might have accepted it. Caleb didn't. Not completely. Still, he respected the hesitation. Military life had taught him that everyone carried stories they weren't ready to tell. He wouldn't force hers. Not tonight. Later, after Caleb walked back across the yard beneath a sky scattered with stars, Lena remained standing on her deck long after his porch light clicked on. Inside her house, tucked safely inside the top drawer of her bedside table, rested a small manila envelope she had not opened in months. Inside it lay a folded newspaper clipping, a printed email from the Navy, and a diamond engagement ring she had never worn. She closed the drawer without touching any of them. Across the yard, Caleb's porch light glowed exactly as it had every evening for the past 6 months. She had kept it burning because she refused to let his home look abandoned. She hadn't known then whether he was alive, only that she couldn't bear the thought of darkness greeting him if he somehow found his way back. Now he was home. Yet the secret born during those silent weeks remained between them like an invisible fence, one far harder to cross than the white picket fence separating their 2 yards. Caleb believed distance came from the ocean. Lena knew the greater distance had been built by fear. And sooner or later, both of them would have to decide whether the truth was worth risking the fragile happiness they had only just begun to share. 3 days passed in the gentle rhythm of ordinary life. Caleb settled into habits that had once seemed too simple to miss. Morning coffee on the porch, a slow jog along the Elizabeth River before the Virginia heat became unbearable, an afternoon spent fixing the fence between his yard and Lena's, not because it truly needed repair, but because it gave them an excuse to spend hours talking over weathered wooden boards. Every conversation felt effortless. Every goodbye felt slightly longer than the one before. Yet beneath the comfort, something remained unfinished. Caleb noticed it in the moments Lena believed he wasn't looking. She laughed freely until someone mentioned the Navy. Her smile dimmed whenever his next deployment came up in conversation. Sometimes he caught her staring at him with an expression that wasn't happiness. It was relief. Relief so profound it bordered on grief. He had seen that look before. On spouses waiting at homecoming ceremonies. On parents embracing children after dangerous missions. On sailors returning from accidents that should have claimed them. It wasn't the expression of someone who had merely missed a neighbor. It belonged to someone who had already mourned. Friday evening brought one of the neighborhood's monthly gatherings. Nothing extravagant. Just folding chairs in the cul-de-sac, homemade desserts balanced on card tables, children chasing one another with glow sticks while adults exchanged stories beneath strings of patio lights. Caleb had barely filled his paper plate when an older woman stopped beside him, Mrs. Donnelly. She was in her 70s, sharp-eyed, and possessed the sort of memory that never forgot birthdays or gossip. "It's good to have you back, sweetheart. It's good to be back." She patted his arm warmly. "You gave that poor girl quite a scare." Caleb frowned. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Donnelly blinked, suddenly realizing she had said more than intended. "Oh." She glanced toward Lena across the street. "I suppose she never told you." "Told me what?" The older woman's smile faltered. "I'm sure it's not my story to tell." Before Caleb could ask another question, someone called Mrs. Donnelly's name from the dessert table. She squeezed his hand. "Just be gentle when she does." Then she walked away. The words lingered all evening. Be gentle. With what? Caleb watched Lena laughing beside a group of neighborhood children as they attempted to roast marshmallows. She looked perfectly at ease. Until their eyes met. Something in his expression must have changed. She immediately sensed it. Later, as the gathering wound down, she approached him. "You've been quiet." "I talked to Mrs. Donnelly." For the first time since his return, genuine fear crossed Lena's face. "What did she say?" "Not much." He searched her eyes. "She said you had a scare while I was gone." Silence. The summer breeze stirred the leaves overhead. Children's laughter drifted farther down the street. Lena looked toward her house. "Come with me." They settled onto her back porch with 2 untouched glasses of iced tea. Night had wrapped the neighborhood in soft blue shadows. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Finally, Lena folded her hands together so tightly her knuckles turned white. There were 19 days. 19? 19 days without communication. Caleb nodded slowly. "We lost satellite access during part of the deployment. I know that now." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "But I didn't know it then." She took a shaky breath. "One Tuesday morning, I was at work." Lena managed a small accounting office in downtown Norfolk, where numbers usually behaved more predictably than emotions. Someone from the office called me into the conference room. She stared into the darkness beyond the porch. The television was on. Caleb's chest tightened. There had been an explosion. His memory returned instantly. A supply vessel operating near their task group had suffered a catastrophic engine fire. Early news reports were chaotic. Several media outlets mistakenly identified his destroyer as one of the damaged ships before the Navy corrected the information hours later. Except, not everyone had seen the correction. Lena continued. "The news anchor said communication had been lost. They were wrong. I know. They corrected it. Not before social media started spreading screenshots." She laughed bitterly. "My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages. Calls. People asking if I'd heard anything. People saying they were sorry." Caleb closed his eyes. He remembered none of it. At sea, they had been completely cut off. No internet. No news. No idea the people back home believed they might be dead. "I drove home," Lena said quietly. "I don't remember the drive." She swallowed. "I just remember sitting on your porch." Caleb looked at her. "You sat there? All afternoon. Why?" "Because..." Her voice broke. "Because if someone came from the Navy, I wanted them to find someone waiting." His heart ached. "Lena, I kept staring at your front door." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I knew it was irrational. I knew no one was coming there. But I couldn't leave." She wiped her eyes, embarrassed. For 3 days the news kept changing. Some reports said survivors. Others didn't. Nobody knew anything. I called every number I could find. No answers. Caleb reached across the small table. Without thinking, he covered her trembling hand with his own. She didn't pull away. I thought you were gone. His thumb brushed gently against her fingers. I'm sorry. I know it wasn't your fault. But grief doesn't wait for facts. She looked down at their joined hands. On the 4th day, her voice grew even softer. Ryan came. Caleb recognized the name immediately. Ryan Holloway. The man Lena had dated years earlier. Their relationship had ended long before Caleb moved next door. What did he want? He said I shouldn't be alone. She smiled sadly. He brought dinner. Flowers. He stayed. Caleb listened without interrupting. I cried for hours. I told him I didn't know how to imagine this street without you. She stopped. The silence stretched. Then came the confession she had rehearsed 100 times and dreaded every day since Caleb returned. He proposed. Caleb's fingers stiffened slightly around hers. I didn't love him. I wasn't thinking. I was exhausted. I believed. Another tear escaped. I believed the person I truly loved was never coming home. The words settled between them with breathtaking honesty. The person I truly loved. Neither acknowledged them. Not yet. I said yes. The sentence barely existed. It emerged as little more than air. Caleb felt something inside him sink. Not anger. Not betrayal. Just an unexpected sadness for everything she must have endured believing he was gone. I wore the ring for less than a day. She laughed through tears. The next morning, the Navy released the corrected report. They confirmed your ship was safe. I remember reading your unit's name over and over. She smiled for the first time that evening. I've never been happier to discover I was wrong. What happened with Ryan? I drove straight to his apartment. You ended it. I gave him the ring back. What did you tell him? The truth. She looked directly into Caleb's eyes. I told him I'd accepted because I was trying to survive losing someone else. Caleb remained silent. He deserved better than that. He was hurt. He was angry. But he understood. She inhaled slowly. We haven't spoken since. So why didn't you tell me? Because every version sounded terrible. She laughed bitterly. Hi, welcome home. By the way, I got engaged because I thought you were dead. I couldn't say those words. I was ashamed. People in town talked. They remembered the engagement. They didn't remember how quickly it ended. They filled in the blanks themselves. She lowered her head. I let them. Caleb stood and walked toward the edge of the porch. The yard between their homes glowed silver beneath the moonlight. For a long moment, neither spoke. Lena prepared herself for the worst. For disappointment. For distance. For the quiet politeness that often follows unbearable truths. Instead, Caleb spoke without turning around. You know what I kept thinking about during deployment? She looked up. I kept telling myself you deserved someone with a normal life. Someone who could promise birthdays, Christmas mornings, weekends. He smiled sadly. So I decided for you. Finally he turned back. You decided your future because you thought mine had ended. I decided yours because I thought I was protecting you. He shook his head. We're both guilty of making choices for someone who never got a vote. Lena's eyes filled again. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't have anything to forgive. You accepted a proposal because you thought I was dead. His voice was steady. If I had really died. He stepped closer. I would have hoped someone was there to keep you from facing that alone. A sob escaped before she could stop it. Caleb gently pulled her into his arms. This embrace was different from the impulsive reunion across the lawn. Slower, quieter. Two people no longer pretending the truth could be postponed. Against his shoulder, Lena whispered the words she had carried for half a year. I loved you before the ocean took you. She closed her eyes. And I loved you even when I thought it never would give you back. Caleb held her a little tighter, his own confession caught behind lips that still feared what loving her might cost. For the first time since coming home, the greatest secret between them had been spoken aloud. Yet neither realized that truth alone could not erase the consequences of 6 months of silence. Some wounds begin healing the moment they are confessed. Others have to survive the judgment of everyone who only knows half the story. The morning after Lena's confession, Maple Street looked exactly as it always had. Children waited for the school bus with backpacks nearly as large as they were. Retirees walked their dogs before the summer heat settled over the neighborhood. The mail carrier waved from his familiar route. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. For the first time in years, Caleb no longer had to wonder what Lena felt. She loved him. The words still echoed in his mind. Not spoken dramatically. Not beneath fireworks or pouring rain. Simply whispered into his shoulder as if they had always belonged there. He should have felt lighter. Instead, he felt the weight of what those words demanded. Love required a future. A future required promises. And promises were dangerous for a man whose life belonged, at least in part, to the United States Navy. That afternoon, Caleb drove into downtown Norfolk to replace a broken phone charger and pick up a few things before returning to base at the end of his leave. As he stepped into the neighborhood hardware store, a familiar voice called his name. Mercer? He turned to see Tyler Grant, an old high school friend. Tyler had traded dreams of traveling the world for running his father's construction company. Married, 2 children, perpetually sunburned, he still carried the easy confidence Caleb remembered from their teenage years. Look who finally remembered where home is. They laughed, shook hands, and spent several minutes catching up. Deployment. Families. Aging parents. The way time somehow sped up after 30. Eventually Tyler grinned. So, Caleb already recognized that smile. So, you and Lena finally figured it out? Caleb laughed. We're talking. Took you long enough. So everyone noticed? Tyler stared at him as though he'd asked whether the Atlantic Ocean contained water. Caleb, half the neighborhood thought you two were secretly dating years ago. We weren't. I know. Tyler smirked. But nobody else believed that. The conversation might have ended there. Instead, Tyler's expression shifted. Something uncertain crossed his face. I almost didn't say anything. About what? It's probably old news. Caleb leaned casually against the shelf of gardening tools. What is? Tyler hesitated. I just don't want to see you blindsided. A strange uneasiness settled into Caleb's chest. Tyler. You know. After everyone thought your ship was gone. Caleb nodded slowly. I know there was some confusion. Confusion? Tyler rubbed the back of his neck. Man, around here people were saying Lena got engaged before anybody even knew for sure what had happened. Caleb frowned. That's not what happened. Tyler blinked. It isn't? No. I figured you knew the whole story. I do. Or at least he thought he did. Tyler seethed. Forget I said anything. But the words had already found their mark. On the drive home, Caleb tried to dismiss the conversation. People in small towns loved incomplete stories. Rumors evolved faster than facts. He knew that. Still, questions crept in. Tyler hadn't sounded malicious. Only convinced. How many people believed Lena had simply moved on? How many different versions of those terrible days existed? By the time he pulled into his driveway, doubt had quietly settled beside compassion. Not because he distrusted Lena. Because rumors had a way of filling empty spaces the truth left behind. Lena noticed the change immediately. She had just finished watering the flower beds when Caleb crossed the yard. His smile was there. But it no longer reached his eyes. You okay? Yeah. She tilted her head. That's not a convincing answer. He hesitated. I ran into Tyler. Understanding flashed across her face almost instantly. What did he say? He mentioned. Caleb searched carefully for the right words. People talking. She closed her eyes for a brief second. So it started. It never stopped, did it? No. They sat on the porch swing. The same place where dozens of ordinary conversations had unfolded over the years. Today, neither knew where this one would end. Caleb spoke carefully. He said people believed you got engaged before anyone knew whether my ship survived. Lena looked down at her hands. They believed that. Did they have a reason to? She answered with painful honesty. They had pieces. But not the whole picture. Caleb nodded. I know. Do you? The question surprised him. I want to. She looked up, her eyes tired. Then ask me. He took a slow breath. When exactly did Ryan propose? The 4th day after the first news reports. And when did you say yes? That night. When did you know I was alive? The following afternoon. And you ended it immediately? I drove straight to his apartment. She didn't hesitate. Not once. Her answers came too quickly to sound rehearsed. Too painfully. Still. A tiny voice inside Caleb whispered something ugly. 4 days. Only 4. He hated himself for thinking it. Hated the unfairness of the thought. Yet emotions rarely ask permission before arriving. Lena watched his face. She recognized the battle happening behind his eyes. You think 4 days wasn't long enough? He didn't answer. She smiled sadly. I've thought the same thing every day for 6 months. The silence between them stretched. Not angry. Just fragile. Finally, Lena stood. Come inside. He followed her without speaking. She walked upstairs to her bedroom, opened the top drawer of her dresser, removed a worn manila envelope, the same envelope she had avoided touching since his return. She handed it to him. I've never shown this to anyone. Inside lay 3 items. A folded newspaper clipping, a printed email, a small velvet ring box. Caleb unfolded the newspaper first. The headline made his stomach tighten. Local Navy vessel feared lost after explosion. He recognized the article immediately. One of the inaccurate early reports. Across the top, someone had circled his ship's name in blue ink. Lena. The second paper was an email. Its timestamp was the following afternoon. Correction issued. USS Hawthorne was not involved in the incident. All crew members confirmed safe. Caleb stared at the time. 23 hours. Less than 1 full day separated those 2 documents. He looked toward Lena. She stood silently by the window. I printed both. I know. I kept them. I know. So I'd never forget how quickly life can become something else. Finally, he opened the ring box. The diamond remained untouched. Bright. Cold. Perfect. I couldn't throw it away, Lena whispered. It wasn't because I wanted it. It was because every time I looked at it, she swallowed. I remembered the woman I became when grief convinced me hope was gone. Caleb gently closed the box. I'm sorry. She laughed quietly. You keep apologizing for things you didn't do. This isn't about the Navy. No. He stepped closer. This is about the fact that while I was worrying about circuit boards and radar systems, you thought I was dead. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then Caleb reached for her hand. I never asked what those 4 days were like. You don't have to. I want to. Lena walked toward the living room. She sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the framed photographs lining the fireplace. My mother called every hour. My sister wanted me to stay with her. I couldn't. Why? She smiled faintly. Because if you came home, I wanted your porch light to be on. Caleb closed his eyes. She continued. I barely slept. I kept imagining Navy officers knocking on my door by mistake. I imagined your parents. I imagined your house staying empty forever. Her voice cracked. I wasn't thinking about marriage. I wasn't thinking about Ryan. I was trying to survive 1 hour at a time. Caleb finally understood. Not intellectually. Emotionally. The timeline no longer mattered. Grief had distorted time itself. 1 day. 4 days. A week. When someone believed the person they loved had vanished beneath the ocean, calendars lost their meaning. He stepped forward. Without saying a word, he wrapped his arms around her again. This time she cried without trying to hide it. Unfortunately, truth rarely traveled as quickly as gossip. Across Maple Street, behind curtains and over backyard fences, another version of the story continued spreading. People remembered seeing Ryan's truck parked outside Lena's house. They remembered hearing about an engagement. They remembered the broken relationship. But memory favored drama over nuance. By sunset, 2 neighbors had already noticed Caleb leaving Lena's house after nearly 2 hours. By dinner, someone posted a photo on the neighborhood Facebook group from the block party a few nights earlier, a harmless picture of Caleb and Lena laughing beside the marshmallow fire. The comments arrived within minutes. Guess they finally made it official. Hope this one lasts longer than the last engagement. Some people sure move on fast. Funny how stories change. Most were subtle. None were completely innocent. Lena saw the post before bedtime. She stared at the screen until it dimmed. For months, she had believed staying silent was the kindest choice. That explaining herself would only reopen old wounds. Now she realized something painful. Silence had not protected her. It had simply allowed everyone else to become the author of her story. Across the yard, Caleb looked out his bedroom window toward the familiar glow of Lena's porch light. For the first time since coming home, he understood that the greatest challenge before them wasn't the ocean, the Navy, or even the months they spent apart. It was convincing a town that had already chosen what it wanted to believe that the truth had always been far more complicated than the rumors whispered over white fences and coffee cups. The rumors did not explode overnight. They settled over Maple Street, the way coastal fog rolled in from the Chesapeake Bay, quietly, almost politely, until one morning people realized they could no longer see clearly through it. By Monday, Caleb noticed the lingering glances. Neighbors who had once waved without hesitation now smiled with the peculiar curiosity reserved for stories they believed they already understood. No one confronted him directly. No one needed to. The whispers did their work. A pause in conversation when he entered the local diner. A knowing look exchanged across the produce aisle at the grocery store. A question that sounded innocent but carried too much weight. So, you and Lena finally worked everything out? Worked what out? The version they imagined. Not the truth. Caleb had spent years in the Navy learning that perception often became reality long before facts caught up. Equipment failures followed procedures. Storms followed forecasts. Human hearts followed neither. He could repair a communications array in rough seas with practiced confidence. He had no idea how to repair the invisible crack growing between what people believed about Lena and who she truly was. What unsettled him even more was realizing that, despite knowing the truth, part of him was still afraid. Not of her past. Of their future. Tuesday evening arrived wrapped in the heavy warmth of late summer. Lena texted him shortly after sunset. To walk? Nothing more. No emojis. No explanation. Just one word. He replied almost immediately. 5 minutes. They met where Maple Street ended, and the paved road gave way to a narrow walking trail that followed the Elizabeth River. The river had always been their neutral ground, far enough from neighbors, far enough from questions, close enough to hear gulls drifting overhead and boats easing through the evening tide. For several minutes, they walked in silence. Not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. The fading sunlight painted the water in streaks of gold and copper. Families packed picnic baskets into SUVs. Teenagers cast fishing lines from the small public dock. Somewhere across the river, a Navy ship eased slowly toward open water. Caleb instinctively watched it. Lena noticed. You still count them. He smiled faintly. I always will. You miss it already. It wasn't a question, he answered honestly. Sometimes. She nodded. I figured. They reached the end of the pier where the water stretched wide and calm before them. Lena rested her elbows on the weathered railing. When do you leave? There it was. The question both had carefully avoided. Caleb stared toward the horizon. 12 days. She closed her eyes briefly. 12. I found out yesterday. And you weren't going to tell me. I was. When? I don't know. When it hurt less. A sad smile crossed her face. It never hurts less. The breeze carried the smell of salt and marsh grass. A buoy bell chimed somewhere in the distance. Finally, Caleb spoke. I almost didn't come back over after our conversation the other night. She looked at him. Why? Because I realized how selfish I'd been. She frowned. I don't understand. He laughed quietly, though there was little humor in it. I've been in love with you for years. The words hung between them. Simple. Undeniable. I think. Maybe since that Thanksgiving, when your smoke detector went off because you forgot the pie. She laughed through unexpected tears. I didn't forget it. You absolutely forgot it. I was distracted. You were trying to cook 6 dishes at once. And you ate the burnt pie anyway. It was terrible. She nudged his shoulder. Liar. It was. But I'd eat it again. Their smiles faded almost as quickly as they appeared. I knew I loved you, Caleb continued. And I decided it didn't matter. Lena's expression softened. Why? Because asking someone to love a career sailor, he searched for words that had lived inside him for years, felt like asking them to volunteer for loneliness. She said nothing. So he continued. I've watched marriages fall apart after deployments. I've watched sailors miss the birth of their children. I've watched wives celebrate anniversaries alone. I've watched husbands stand at funerals over video calls because they couldn't get home in time. His voice became quieter. I promised myself I would never ask someone to carry that. Lena turned to face him completely. So you made the decision for them. I thought I was protecting them. No. Her answer came gently. You were protecting yourself. He blinked. What? If nobody ever had the chance to say yes, then nobody could blame you for leaving. The words landed harder than she intended, or perhaps exactly as hard as they needed to. Caleb looked away. You think that's why? I think it's part of it. He rested both hands on the railing. My father was Navy. She nodded. I know. He missed almost everything. Birthdays, school plays, Christmas. When he was home, he was exhausted. When he left, my mother cried after he drove away. Lena remained silent. I spent my whole childhood promising myself I'd never make someone live like that. He laughed bitterly. And somehow I joined the Navy anyway. She stepped closer. Caleb. No. He shook his head. You deserve mornings where you know your husband is coming home. You deserve someone who can promise vacations, dinners, weekends, a future you don't have to read about through military schedules. You deserve certainty. Lena listened until he finished. Then she asked quietly, "Who told you I wanted certainty more than I wanted you?" He had no answer. She took another step. Now only inches separated them. "You keep saying what I deserve. Because it's true." "No." Her voice remained calm. "It's what you've decided." He opened his mouth. She didn't let him interrupt. "You've spent years making choices for me. You decided I shouldn't fall in love with you. You decided waiting would hurt me too much. You decided your deployments were impossible for me. You decided I deserved someone else." A tear slipped down her cheek. "And you never asked what I wanted." The river seemed to fall silent around them. Even the breeze felt still. Lena's voice trembled now. "Do you know what hurt the most these last 7 years?" He shook his head. "It wasn't the waiting. It wasn't the deployments. It wasn't the months without hearing your voice." She swallowed hard. "It was standing 3 feet away from the man I loved, while he kept pretending he wasn't allowed to love me back." Caleb felt something inside him break. Not dramatically, quietly, like a rope pulled too tight for too long. "I thought." His voice failed him. He tried again. "I thought loving you meant letting you go." Lena smiled sadly. "And I spent years hoping you'd realize loving someone sometimes means giving them the chance to stay." Neither moved. The last sunlight disappeared beneath the horizon. The harbor lights flickered to life one by one. Finally, Caleb whispered, "I wrote you letters." She looked surprised. "What?" "Not the ones I mailed." He smiled faintly. "The real ones." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "I wrote dozens. Sometimes after midnight. Sometimes after rough days. I'd tell you everything. How much I missed home. How I imagined drinking coffee on your porch. How scared I was every time the ship entered dangerous waters." He looked embarrassed. "Then I'd tear them up." "Why?" "Because if you read them, you'd know how much I loved you." Lena reached up and gently touched his face. Her fingertips were warm against skin weathered by salt and sun. "You've been protecting me from a life I never got to choose." He closed his eyes. "I know. You know what I wanted?" "What?" "You. Even if it meant lonely birthdays. Even if it meant deployments. Even if it meant sleeping beside an empty pillow half the year." Her voice cracked. "I wasn't asking for an easy love. I was asking for an honest one." Caleb's eyes filled for the first time since coming home. "I was afraid." She nodded. "I know." "No." He laughed weakly. "You don't. I've been shot at. I've sailed through storms. I've watched electrical fires spread below deck. None of that scared me as much as standing here." "Why?" "Because ships sink. Equipment fails. People recover." He looked directly into her eyes. "But if I let myself love you, and someday you decided this life was too much, I don't think I'd recover from that." Lena understood then. Not just his silence. Its source. It had never been indifference. It had never even been duty alone. It was fear. A fear so profound that he had disguised it as sacrifice. Slowly, she slipped her fingers through his. "You don't get to decide when I stop loving you." He squeezed her hand. "And you don't get to decide for me whether I'm strong enough to wait." A long silence settled between them. This one felt different. Not empty. Full. Filled with everything they had finally stopped hiding. Without another word, Caleb lifted his free hand and gently brushed a strand of auburn hair behind Lena's ear. It was the smallest touch, yet somehow more intimate than every embrace they had shared before. She leaned into it instinctively. He rested his forehead against hers. No audience. No dramatic declarations. Only the sound of water moving against wooden pilings beneath the pier. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. She smiled through tears. "Neither do I." "Then what do we do?" Her answer came without hesitation. "We stop deciding alone." For the first time in years, Caleb allowed himself to imagine a future that wasn't built entirely around departures. He imagined arrivals. Shared mornings. phone calls answered instead of avoided, arguments that ended with honesty instead of silence. It wasn't certainty. The Navy could never promise that. But standing there beneath the first stars of the evening, he realized certainty had never been what Lena wanted. She wanted a choice. And at last, he was ready to give her one. Neither of them noticed the figure standing near the entrance to the trail, partially hidden behind a parked pickup truck. Ryan Holloway had come to clear his head after work. Instead, he had witnessed enough of their conversation to understand one thing with painful clarity. Lena had never truly belonged to his past. Her heart had always been waiting for the sailor, who kept leaving, and somehow, always found his way home. The call came on a Thursday morning. Caleb had barely finished his first cup of coffee when his government-issued phone vibrated across the kitchen counter. He didn't need to look at the screen. Years in the Navy had taught him that certain calls carried a weight before they were even answered. He picked up. Mercer. His executive officer's voice came through immediately. Morning, petty officer. Sorry to cut your leave short. Caleb's stomach tightened. How short? A pause. 48 hours. He closed his eyes. Understood. Our deployment schedule has changed. Another vessel suffered mechanical failures, and your unit is filling the gap. I'll report to base tomorrow evening. Appreciate it. The line went dead. The kitchen suddenly felt much smaller. 48 hours. 2 days ago, he'd still believed he had nearly 2 weeks left. Now, the calendar had collapsed beneath him. Across the yard, Lena was kneeling beside a flower bed, her garden gloves dusted with dark soil. She looked up as Caleb stepped onto his porch. Something in his face made her stand immediately. What happened? He walked toward the fence separating their properties. I have to leave. She smiled faintly. I know. No. He swallowed. I leave Saturday morning. The smile disappeared. Saturday? They moved the deployment up. How much? It was supposed to be another 12 days. She counted silently. That's 48 hours. Neither spoke. A breeze stirred the wind chimes hanging beneath Lena's porch roof. Their soft music sounded strangely cruel. Lena climbed through the open gate instead of walking around it. She stopped directly in front of him. When did you find out? Just now. And your first thought? Caleb hesitated. She already knew the answer. You were going to tell me after you'd figured everything out yourself. He looked down. I was? She sighed, not in anger, but in weary recognition. We just had this conversation. I know. You promised. I know. So why? His answer came almost instinctively. Because that's what I do. The honesty hurt more than an excuse would have. For a long moment, Lena simply looked at him. You know what's strange? What? I don't think you're afraid of leaving. I'm not. I think you're afraid of being missed. He stared at her. She continued softly. If nobody waits, then nobody gets hurt. That afternoon passed in a blur of practical tasks. Laundry, packing, checking travel documents, responding to military emails. Caleb moved through each responsibility with practiced efficiency. His hands knew exactly what to do. His heart did not. Every folded uniform reminded him of another goodbye. Every zipped compartment echoed years of departures. Across the yard, Lena watched from her kitchen window. She wanted to help. She didn't. Some things every sailor insisted on packing alone. By evening, the sun had surrendered to a sky streaked with lavender and deep blue. A knock sounded at Caleb's front door. He opened it to find Lena holding 2 paper bags. Dinner. You cooked? I wasn't going to let your last meal home be frozen pizza. He smiled despite everything. Come in. They ate on the back porch. Neither mentioned deployment for nearly an hour. Instead, they talked about trivial things. The new bakery downtown. A television show they both pretended not to enjoy. Mrs. Donnelly's ongoing battle with the neighborhood squirrels. They laughed. Perhaps more than either expected. Sometimes people laughed hardest when they were trying not to cry. As darkness settled, Caleb finally broke the silence. Lena. She looked up. I've been thinking. She smiled gently. That usually worries me. It should. Her smile faded. I don't think we should do this. The words landed like a sudden drop in temperature. She didn't misunderstand. She couldn't. Do what? This. He gestured helplessly between them. Us. For several seconds, she simply stared at him. Not because she hadn't heard. Because she wished she hadn't. You're serious. I have to be. No. Her voice remained calm. You've decided to be. Lena. You promised. I know what I promised. Then keep it. He stood and walked toward the edge of the porch. His back faced her. The same posture she'd seen whenever he struggled to say something painful. I leave in 2 days. I know. I could be gone 8 months. I know. I might miss Thanksgiving. I know. Christmas. I know. Your birthday. I know. My sister's wedding. I know. He turned. Then why are we pretending this is fair? She rose slowly from her chair. Who said love was fair? It isn't. Exactly. She took a step closer. So why are you measuring it by fairness? Caleb laughed bitterly. Because somebody has to. No. She shook her head. You're measuring it by fear. I'm measuring it by reality. So am I. Their voices remained quiet. That somehow made the conversation more intense. He looked toward the yard separating their homes. When I was 24, there was a chief on my first ship. She waited. He had a daughter. She was 6. He missed almost every birthday she'd ever had. Caleb swallowed. One deployment, she stopped talking to him over video calls. She didn't understand why he kept leaving. What happened? They got divorced. Silence. I promised myself. He smiled sadly. I'd never ask someone to build that kind of life with me. Lena listened carefully. When he finished, she nodded once. Can I tell you a story? He looked surprised. Of course. The first winter after you moved in. He frowned, trying to remember. You slipped on your front steps. I did. You broke your wrist. I fractured it. You couldn't shovel snow. He laughed softly. I remember. So every morning before work, I cleared your driveway. You never told me. I know. Why? Because I wasn't doing it so you'd thank me. She smiled. I was doing it because caring about someone isn't a negotiation. She walked until only inches separated them. You keep showing me the worst examples. He frowned. What? Failed marriages. Lonely children. Broken families. She gently placed a hand against his chest. But you're forgetting something. What? None of those people were us. The words settled deeply. She continued. You've spent years collecting evidence that love can fail. Because it does. Yes. She nodded. It does. So has friendship. So have careers. So have dreams. She looked directly into his eyes. That doesn't stop people from trying. He closed his eyes. Lena? No. This time she interrupted him. Listen. He did. I already know you're leaving. I knew that before we admitted we loved each other. I knew that the day I ran barefoot across the yard. I knew it every night I turned on your porch light. Her voice trembled. I never asked you to stay. I only asked you to stop pretending I couldn't survive if you left. Caleb felt every carefully built defense beginning to collapse. Still, one remained. What if something happens? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her pocket. She removed a folded piece of paper. What is that? Open it. He unfolded it carefully. Inside was one of the letters she'd written during his last deployment. Unlike the cheerful letters she'd mailed, this one had never been sent. The paper was worn from being read too many times. He recognized her handwriting immediately. If you're reading this, it means you made it home. If you never do, then I hope somewhere you knew that someone waited for you every single night. Not because she had to. Because loving you was never the difficult part. Living without telling you was. Caleb stopped reading. His vision blurred. You wrote this. The day after the false report. I couldn't mail it. Why not? Because I didn't know where you were. He folded the letter with trembling hands. I don't deserve this. No. She smiled softly. You don't. He looked up, startled. You deserve someone who tells you the truth. She took the letter back and slipped it into his hand again. So here's the truth. I don't need promises that you'll never leave. I need a promise that when you do, you'll still come home to me. The sentence shattered the last wall Caleb had built. He stepped forward, so suddenly that Lena barely had time to breathe before he wrapped both arms around her. Not cautiously, not politely, completely. I'm terrified, he admitted into her hair. I know. I don't know how to be the man you deserve. She smiled against his shoulder. Then stop trying to be perfect. Be honest. They stood together beneath the porch light, the same light Lena had faithfully switched on every evening during his absence. For the first time, Caleb understood it had never been a symbol of hope that he would return. It was a promise that, No matter how long the darkness lasted, someone would always leave a light burning for him. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. When I get back. She gently pressed a finger against his lips. No. What? We're done talking about when you get back, like life only begins after deployment. She smiled. Our relationship starts now. The next morning, Caleb reported to Naval Station Norfolk to complete his pre-deployment processing, medical checks, equipment issue, security briefings. The familiar rhythm of military life quickly reclaimed him, yet something had changed. For years, every departure had felt like walking away from an empty house. Now, every mile carried the weight of someone waiting. That realization brought comfort. It also brought fear unlike anything he had ever experienced. Late that afternoon, as he exited the administration building, his phone vibrated. An unknown number. He answered. Mercer. A familiar voice replied. This is Ryan Holloway. Caleb stopped walking. I think there's something you need to know before your ship sails. The line went quiet. Whatever Ryan had called to say, it wasn't spoken out of jealousy. His voice carried something else. Concern. And Caleb suddenly realized that the greatest test of his relationship with Lena might not come from the ocean this time. It might come from a truth that none of them, not Caleb, not Lena, and not even Ryan, had fully understood yet. The unknown number stayed on Caleb's phone long after the call ended. He hadn't answered immediately. For several rings, he had simply stared at the screen, debating whether the past deserved another conversation. Eventually, he pressed accept. Mercer. A quiet breath answered first. Then Ryan Holloway spoke. I wasn't sure you'd pick up. I'm surprised you called. I know. Another pause. This isn't about getting Lena back. Caleb leaned against the hood of his truck in the parking lot outside Naval Station Norfolk. I figured. I just think there's something you should hear before you leave. They agreed to meet at a small coffee shop overlooking the marina. It was nearly empty. The lunchtime crowd had already disappeared, leaving only the soft hiss of an espresso machine and the distant cries of gulls circling above the harbor. Ryan stood when Caleb walked in. He looked older than Caleb remembered. Not because of age. Because disappointment had a way of settling permanently around someone's eyes. Neither man offered a handshake. Neither seemed offended by that. I appreciate you coming. You said it was important. It is. Ryan wrapped both hands around a cup of untouched coffee. I've spent 6 months trying to be angry at Lena. Caleb remained silent. I couldn't. Ryan smiled faintly. You know what finally made me realize why? Caleb shook his head. The day I proposed. He laughed softly. She said yes. But she cried. Caleb felt his chest tighten. Not happy tears. Ryan looked toward the marina. The kind people cry when they're saying goodbye to someone who's still alive in their heart. He took a slow breath. I knew in that moment. I wasn't competing with another man. I was competing with hope. Caleb listened without interrupting. I convinced myself she'd heal. Ryan continued. I told myself grief makes people confused. It does. I thought if I loved her enough, eventually she'd look at me the way she looked toward your house every evening. He smiled sadly. She never did. What happened after the Navy corrected the report? Ryan didn't hesitate. She came straight to my apartment. He laughed quietly. I'd already bought champagne. The memory clearly still hurt. She handed me the ring before I even opened the door. What did she say? Ryan looked directly at Caleb. She said, I thought the man I loved was gone. Now I know he isn't. If I stay here, I'll spend the rest of my life lying to both of us. Ryan swallowed. I couldn't hate her after that. Caleb finally spoke. I'm sorry. Ryan smiled. So am I. He looked out toward the water where a gray Navy destroyer rested in the distance. You know what makes me angry? What? Not that she loved you. Caleb frowned. That you spent years pretending not to love her. The words landed with uncomfortable precision. Ryan leaned back in his chair. Do you have any idea how many times she defended you? Caleb blinked. What do you mean? When people complained that you missed neighborhood parties. He's deployed. When they joked, you cared more about ships than people. You don't know him. When they wondered why you'd never dated anyone seriously. Ryan smiled. She always found a reason. He shook his head. The whole neighborhood could see she loved you. Except you. Caleb lowered his eyes. Ryan wasn't accusing him. That somehow made it worse. I thought I was protecting her. I know. Ryan nodded. She told me. What? The night she ended our engagement, Ryan remembered every word. He thinks he's sparing me. He doesn't realize deciding for someone isn't love. Ryan smiled. I've thought about that sentence a lot. They sat quietly for several moments. Finally, Ryan stood. I didn't ask you here to make you feel guilty. Then why? Because if you leave again without trusting her, you'll break her heart far worse than I ever could. Caleb looked up. Ryan offered a tired smile. She already proved she'll wait. The question is, will you finally let her? That afternoon, Caleb drove home beneath gathering storm clouds. Ryan's words echoed through every mile. She already proved she'll wait. For years, he'd imagined himself carrying the heavier burden. The deployments, the danger, the separation. Only now did he begin to understand the courage required of the person who stayed behind. Waiting wasn't passive, it was its own kind of service. When he pulled into Maple Street, he found Lena sitting on his front porch. Not hers. His. She wore jeans, one of his old navy sweatshirts he'd once lent her during a chilly autumn bonfire, and held 2 mugs of coffee balanced carefully beside her. You were supposed to be packing. I finished. You were supposed to text me. I know. She smiled. I wanted to surprise you. He climbed the steps slowly. We need to talk. I figured. You always say that when something important happened. They sat side by side. The porch swing creaked gently beneath their weight. For a while, neither reached for the coffee. I met Ryan. She stiffened. He called you. He did. Fear flashed across her face. What did he say? The truth. She searched his expression. Which part? That you ended things because you loved me. She relaxed slightly. Anything else? He said the whole neighborhood knew. She laughed softly. Apparently we weren't very subtle. Caleb turned toward her. I owe you an apology. She smiled. You've apologized a lot lately. Not enough. He took a long breath. I spent years believing I was making noble decisions. You were trying. I wasn't. He shook his head. I was hiding. Lena waited. He continued. I kept telling myself I was protecting you. I know. But protection without trust, he smiled faintly, is just another way of saying I didn't believe you could make your own choices. She looked at him with quiet surprise. You've been thinking. Ryan helped. She laughed despite herself. I never thought I'd owe my ex-boyfriend anything. Neither did I. Rain began falling lightly. Neither moved. Small drops tapped against the porch roof. The smell of wet earth drifted through the neighborhood. Caleb watched the rain gather on the edge of the steps. Do you know what bravery looked like to me? She shook her head. Standing watch during storms. Running toward electrical fires. Keeping equipment online while missiles were being tracked. He smiled. I thought courage belonged to sailors. And now? He looked at her. Now I think courage looks like you. She blinked. What? You waited. You believed. You kept my porch light on. You loved someone who gave you almost every reason to walk away. His voice cracked. I was never the brave one. Lena reached for his hand. You were. No, Caleb. She squeezed his fingers gently. Courage isn't a competition. He smiled. I know. It's different. She nodded. You faced storms. I faced silence. We survived different oceans. The sentence lingered between them. Different oceans. The same loneliness. He turned fully toward her. I don't want to leave. I know. If I could resign tomorrow. She interrupted him by gently shaking her head. I don't want you to. He frowned. What? I fell in love with all of you. The man. The sailor. The neighbor who fixes everyone's porch steps. The technician who gets excited talking about radar systems. She smiled. I don't want pieces. I want the whole person. The rain intensified. Still, they remained on the porch. Across the street, curtains shifted as neighbors undoubtedly noticed them sitting together in the storm. For once, neither cared. I have one question. Lena looked at him. Ask. When this deployment ends. She smiled. Yes? I don't want to come home wondering anymore. She waited. I don't want us to keep living in 2 houses. A tear formed in the corner of her eye. You don't? No. I've wasted enough years. He reached into the pocket of his jeans. Not for a ring. He wasn't ready for that. Instead, he pulled out a small brass key, the spare key to his house. He placed it gently in Lena's palm. I should have given you this years ago. She looked down. You trust me with your home? He smiled. I trust you with my life. She closed her fingers around the key as though it were something infinitely more valuable than metal. Then Caleb did something neither of them had expected. He stood, walked to the edge of the porch, and, in full view of Maple Street, turned back toward Lena. For years, he'd hidden his feelings because he feared the consequences. He was done hiding. Lena Brooks. She laughed through tears. What are you doing? Probably embarrassing myself. You definitely are. He smiled. Good. The front doors of neighboring houses began opening. Mrs. Donnelly stepped onto her porch. The Johnson twins paused their basketball game. Mr. Alvarez lowered the hood of his pickup truck. Caleb didn't care. He looked only at Lena. Loving you doesn't make me weaker. She covered her mouth. It doesn't distract me from my duty. Her tears spilled freely now. It gives me a reason to come home. The neighborhood disappeared. There was only the two of them. I can't promise every deployment will end safely. I can't promise I'll never miss birthdays. I can't promise this life will be easy. He took one slow step toward her. But I can promise one thing, she whispered. What? I'll never make another decision about our future without you standing beside me. Lena crossed the porch before he finished speaking. She wrapped her arms around him with the same unguarded urgency she'd shown the day he returned home barefoot across the yard. Only this time, there was no uncertainty, no misunderstanding, no hidden confession waiting beneath the surface. Just two people finally choosing each other, not despite the risks. Because love had become worth sharing those risks together. Around them, Maple Street grew strangely quiet. Mrs. Donnelly smiled into her tea. Mr. Alvarez nodded once before returning to his truck. The Johnson twins exchanged grins. Sometimes, even a neighborhood built on rumors recognized the moment when the truth finally spoke loudly enough to silence them. Before dawn the next morning, Caleb loaded his bags into his truck. The streets were still dark. The porch light glowed behind him. This time, he didn't leave believing he was sparing Lena from pain. He left knowing they had chosen this road together. And for the first time in his Navy career, he understood that surviving the sea was only half the journey. The greater courage was allowing someone to stand on shore, keep the light burning, and trust that coming home was no longer his burden alone. The ocean had a peculiar way of changing time. Some days passed so slowly that every hour seemed carved into steel. Others disappeared before a sailor noticed the sun had risen and set again. 8 months came and went somewhere between midnight watches, emergency repairs, holiday meals served on metal trays, and video messages downloaded whenever the ship briefly entered range of a secure satellite connection. For the first time in Caleb Mercer's career, every difficult day ended the same way. Not with silence. With Lena. Sometimes it was a voice message she had recorded while walking through the neighborhood. Sometimes it was a photograph of the first snowfall covering Maple Street. Sometimes it was nothing more than a picture of his porch light glowing against the evening sky. No caption. None was necessary. She had made a promise. The light would stay on. Thousands of miles away, life continued without him. Lena returned to work every morning at the accounting office in downtown Norfolk. She attended neighborhood cookouts. She shoveled snow from both driveways after an unexpected January storm. She watered his roses when spring arrived. She collected his mail. She argued with Mrs. Donnelly over whose lemon bars deserved first prize at the church fundraiser. She laughed. She cried. She waited. Not because waiting had become easier. Because it had finally become shared. Every week, Caleb wrote. Not the short, carefully edited letters he'd once mailed. The real ones. The ones he had spent years tearing into pieces. He wrote about exhaustion. About homesickness. About fear. About the absurd arguments sailors had over coffee brands. About watching dolphins race alongside the ship at sunrise. About missing ordinary things. The smell of Lena's coffee. The squeak of the porch swing. The sound of sprinklers running across neighboring lawns. The letters never pretended deployment wasn't difficult. They simply refused to let silence become another wall between them. One evening, somewhere in the Pacific, the ship lost power during a violent storm. Emergency lights flooded narrow passageways in deep red. Equipment alarms echoed throughout the vessel. Caleb spent nearly 16 hours restoring damaged communication systems while waves slammed against the hull with frightening force. When everything was finally stable, he stumbled toward his bunk completely exhausted. He opened his phone. One message had finally downloaded. It contained only a photograph. His front porch. Rain falling. the porch light glowing warmly through the darkness. Below it, Lena had written only one sentence. No matter how rough the sea gets, there's always a light waiting for you. Caleb stared at the screen for a long time. Then, for the first time in his Navy career, he allowed himself to cry where no one could see him, not because he was afraid, because he finally understood what home meant. Spring slowly returned to Virginia. Maple Street bloomed with dogwoods and azaleas. The rumors faded, not because anyone formally corrected them, because the neighborhood quietly witnessed something stronger than gossip. Every holiday, Lena still placed a small American flag beside Caleb's porch. Every weekend, she still cared for his house. She no longer hid when people asked why. I love him. The answer was always simple, never defensive, never apologetic. Eventually, people stopped asking. Late one April afternoon, Lena was kneeling beside the flower bed near Caleb's mailbox, replacing winter pansies with bright yellow daisies. She wore old jeans streaked with dirt. A faded baseball cap shaded her eyes. The radio on her porch played softly while she worked. Nothing about the afternoon felt unusual, which was exactly why she almost missed the familiar pickup truck turning onto Maple Street. It moved slowly, as though the driver wanted to savor every familiar house, every tree, every crack in the pavement. Lena looked up. The shovel slipped from her hands. For one suspended heartbeat, the world stood perfectly still. Caleb. He was home. Months earlier, she had run barefoot across the yard before thinking. This time, she didn't move. Not because she loved him less. Because she realized something beautiful. She didn't have to chase him anymore. He had already begun walking. Caleb parked the truck, stepped out, closed the door. His sea bag rested in the truck bed, forgotten. Instead of heading toward his own front porch, he turned immediately toward hers. One step, then another, then another. Across the same stretch of grass that had quietly witnessed years of unspoken love. Lena smiled through tears. You came to the wrong house. He laughed. No. I finally came to the right one. She covered her mouth, trying unsuccessfully to stop crying. You've been planning that line for about 6 months. It needs work. I know. She laughed harder. So do I. When they finally stood face to face, neither hurried into an embrace. There was no urgency left. No fear that one of them might disappear before another word could be spoken. Instead, Caleb simply reached for her hands. He looked at them carefully. The same hands that had turned on his porch light hundreds of evenings. The same hands that had written letters across oceans. The same hands that had never let go, even when he believed they should. They're cold, he said softly. I was gardening. You still take care of my flowers. They're stubborn. So am I. You definitely are. He smiled. I used to think coming home meant unlocking my front door. She tilted her head. And now? Now I think. He looked into her eyes. Coming home starts the moment I see you. They walked together toward the white picket fence that had once seemed like a much larger barrier. Caleb rested one hand on the gate. You know, I've crossed this yard hundreds of times. I know, but somehow. He laughed quietly. This is the first time I've crossed it without wondering whether I was allowed. Lena squeezed his hand. You always were. I know that now. The evening settled gently over Maple Street. Porch lights flickered on one by one. Children chased each other along the sidewalks. Someone grilled hamburgers somewhere down the block. A dog barked excitedly at absolutely nothing. Life continued exactly as it always had. Ordinary. Peaceful. Real. Caleb reached into his jacket pocket. Lena noticed the small velvet box before he even spoke. She looked at him with amused disbelief. You've got to be kidding. What? You spent years avoiding one conversation. And now you're carrying a ring? I've had a lot of time to think. She laughed. I'd hope so. He opened the box. A simple platinum ring caught the golden light of sunset. Nothing extravagant. Just elegant. Honest. Like everything they had finally become. Caleb didn't kneel immediately. Instead, he looked around the neighborhood. Mrs. Donnelly was watering roses. Mr. Alvarez pretended to wash his truck for the 3rd time that week. The Johnson twins, now taller than either of them remembered, were shooting basketballs across the street. Every one of them discreetly pretending not to watch. Caleb smiled. Then he looked back at Lena. I spent years believing love meant protecting you from every possible pain. It doesn't. She shook her head gently. No. I finally understand. He took a slow breath. Love means trusting you enough to let you choose the journey with me. Tears gathered in Lena's eyes. He continued. I can't promise every goodbye will be easy. I can't promise there won't be more deployments. I can't promise life won't scare us. He smiled. But I can promise. I'll never face any of it without asking you to stand beside me. Only then did he lower himself onto one knee. Lena Brooks. Will you marry me? She stared at him, then at the ring, then back at him. A tear rolled slowly down her cheek. Finally, she laughed. Not because anything was funny, because joy sometimes sounded exactly like relief. You know what I love most about this? He smiled nervously. What? You asked. He blinked. What? You didn't decide for me. She knelt beside him until they were eye to eye. For the first time. You let me choose. She kissed him softly before answering. Yes. Yes, Caleb. Yes to the sailor. Yes to the waiting. Yes to the lonely birthdays. Yes to every homecoming. Yes to every porch light. And yes to every ordinary day in between. Applause broke the quiet. Mrs. Donnelly clapped first. Mr. Alvarez whistled. The Johnson twins cheered loud enough for half the neighborhood to hear. Lena laughed, burying her face against Caleb's shoulder. We're never living this down. I don't mind. Neither do I. Later that night, after the congratulations faded and the neighborhood finally returned to its peaceful routine, Caleb stood alone on his front porch. Across the yard, Lena's house glowed warmly beneath the stars. She stepped outside carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She didn't call his name. She simply smiled. Caleb crossed the yard without hesitation. No uncertainty. No excuse. No fear. The distance between the 2 houses had never really been measured in steps. It had been measured in unspoken words. Tonight, there were none left. As they settled together on the porch swing, the familiar porch light burned quietly above them. Years earlier, it had been a symbol of hope. Later, it became a promise. Now, it meant something even greater. It was home. Not because it illuminated a house, but because it illuminated 2 hearts that had finally stopped protecting each other from love and started trusting each other with it. The sea would call Caleb again. That much was certain. Storms would come. Deployments would return. Goodbyes would never become easy. But neither of them feared those things anymore. Because every voyage, no matter how long or how dangerous, now ended with the same quiet certainty. A porch light still burning, and someone waiting not out of obligation, but out of choice.